Well, good morning, everyone. It's time to get started with our class. If you would, be opening your Bibles to Acts chapter 27. Acts chapter 27. And we're going to begin this morning in verse 9. Acts 27, verse 9. Good to see everybody. We've got several with us that have been out sick and having procedures and different things going on. It's good to see Jadon doing better and able to be back with us. And Miss Kathy was not feeling well last week, and glad she's able to be here. I know the Penns have had some health things going on. A lot of people struggling with different things at this time, and glad that you're doing better and able to be with us today. Okay, before we start our class, Jared, would you lead us in a word of prayer?
Our God, Father, we come before you this morning thanking you for another opportunity that we have to gather together as family, Lord, to dive into your word, to learn more about you and how we need to be living and governing our lives. Lord, we ask a special prayer for those this morning who weren't able to be here, those who are struggling with various different things, and we ask that you please help them to get back to their much wanted health and get back to us as soon as possible. We'd also like to ask a special prayer this morning for the teachers, Brother Josh, the ladies downstairs, Lord, who are doing their best to teach the young ones who are growing up in a crazy world, Lord. Brother Josh, who is leading our thoughts this morning. Please be with all of us. Help us to open our minds and our hearts and apply what we hear this morning. Lord, let's go the rest of this Bible. In Christ's name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. And I'll just say, along with something that Jared mentioned in his prayer, unless I miscounted, we have somewhere between 12 and 15 children downstairs this morning. And so that's wonderful to see so many. I know that we have some that are visiting with us, but we have most of our regulars here today as well. And so it is so wonderful to see that many children here today. And we need to do all that we can to encourage them. Well, where we left off in our lesson, Paul and his fellow prisoners and those Roman soldiers that were guarding him, they are on a ship. They are headed toward Rome. But due to the time of year that they set sail, they're having a very difficult journey. The winds aren't cooperating. They've already had to change their course a couple of times. And where we left off last week, they have arrived at a place that really was not on their chart of a place to stop, but they had to stop there because the weather was so bad. They were at a place called Fair Havens. As verse 8 tells us, it's close to the city of Lasea. Well, they're going to stay at Fair Havens until the weather gets better. Well, apparently from the way the text reads, it took a while before the weather was decent enough for them to set sail. And if you notice in verse 9, it says, "Now when much time had been spent, and sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was already over." Paul advised them. So starting out, it mentions the fast. When you go back and you look at the different feast times of the Jews, and you look at what they referred to by certain titles, what they would refer to as the fast was what they called the Day of Atonement. And this would have been the day one time a year that the priest would go into the most holy place of the temple. And typically this took place around the end of, in our calendar system, around the end of September, the 1st of October. Now, anyone that has done much traveling, especially in places that are close to the ocean or especially places that are up in the mountains, you know that usually that time period around the end of September, the 1st of October, is when bad weather usually starts to take place. There's more rain. You get up in the mountains, there's more snow. I know that several years ago when Christy and I drove to Alaska, we waited a little too long to leave to try to head back. And we didn't head back until the middle of October. Well, everything looked fine in Anchorage, but when we got up into the mountains, we drove into a lot of snow. And we just about didn't make it through. We just about had to turn back. Well, It's because that time of year is when things start to change. Now, we live in a more temperate climate. Things don't change as rapidly here as they do in other parts of the world. But especially you look around the Mediterranean Sea where this was taking place. In the fall of the year, that area is notorious for strong storms. Storms that they don't refer to as hurricanes, but they have what we would consider hurricane force winds. And what would take place, and you see this even still to this day, there are certain times of the year on the Mediterranean Sea that ships just do not get too far from land because the weather can change so rapidly. Well, what happened, they had arrived at Fair Havens, and it took so long for the weather they were facing at that time to let up that it was now in this time of year that was very uncertain. And as we come on into the next verse, it tells us that Paul advised them, and this is talking about the centurions, the guards that were there guarding these prisoners, saying, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also of our lives." And so starting out at this point, he says, you know what, folks? He said, this is not a good idea. This is a time of year that we really don't need to be getting out on the sea. We need to just lay low here. We need to wait until spring and then sail on. Well, that again was a common practice in those days. There were certain ports where sailors would winter. They would go into those places and there they would remain until the spring would come, and then they would continue on with their journeys. Well, that's what Paul is recommending. We don't need to get out and risk the ship. We don't need to risk the cargo, and we sure don't need to risk the lives of those who are on this ship. But as we continue then, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. So here you have these sailors, these men that were used to being out on the sea, and they were convinced, no, everything's going to be okay. We'll be able to make it. And so the centurion, they agreed that rather than listen to what Paul had to say, well, we know from our study last week that the centurion had already established a lot of trust in Paul. Paul was allowed on one occasion to even leave the ship and go visit with his brethren for a time. But the centurion placed more thought and more trust into the sailors. Well, these were men who were accustomed to being out on the sea. And a couple of the sources that I looked at said one of the reasons why these sailors probably did not want to remain in this place is because Fair Havens was not one of those port cities that people generally wintered in. There were not as many resources there. It would be a much more difficult place for them to find lodging and meals and things of that nature. And so they really didn't want to stay in this location. They wanted to try to get somewhere else. And we'll see as we continue on down that they really wanted to get to the city of Phoenix, or Phoenice, as some translations have it. This was a larger town with a large harbor, a place that would be much more suited for them to winter. They didn't want to stay in Fair Havens. And so what took place, because, as 12 says, the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. The significance of these directions is because the weather in that Mediterranean region usually comes from the opposite of those directions. They did not want to be in a place where the winds would be blowing into the harbor and threatening to run the ships ashore. They would rather have the winds coming from behind them, where, the topography of the land would be able to block some of that, and then the anchors would be able to hold those ships in place. This was their hope. They wanted to get to a more suitable place. That way they could winter in that location. Verse 13, when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. And so they waited in Fair Havens until they recognized that the wind was blowing in the direction that they wanted to go. And so they thought, this is our chance. We need to get out on the sea. We need to try to get to Phoenix while the winds are blowing the way that we want them to. And notice it says that they got close to where they were going. They got close to the shoreline of Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. Now, I do not know why, and I've done some study of this, I don't know why they retained the Greek name for this wind. When you look at the definition of this, literally it means hurricane force or typhonic winds, typhoon. What this is saying is that this was a very strong storm that blew in. Being in the northern hemisphere, this would have been considered, based upon our terminology, this would have been a hurricane. In the southern hemisphere, they call them typhoons. But yet, they retain this term Euroclydon. This was the Greek term for what we consider a hurricane. So they're out on the sea, and it's not just a thunderstorm that blows in, not something that these sailors were accustomed to being able to sail through and drop their anchor and just weather. This was a severe storm. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. Meaning when they could no longer adjust the sail and keep it in the direction that they wanted it to go, they took down the sails and they just let the ship go along with the course of the wind. They let the ship drive in whatever direction the wind would carry it. They thought that this would be the safest course. If they tried to fight against those winds, it would put a lot more pressure, not only upon the sails, but upon the structure of that ship. And so they thought, well, we will just go with the flow. We'll go with the winds, and once this all dies down, then we'll change our course. We'll get back to where we need to go. They thought this was the safest course. And really, at this point, it was. This was the safest thing that they could have done. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. In those days, you look at many large ships today, and oftentimes they will have their lifeboats either on the deck of the ship or attached to the side of the ship in some way. In those days, they would drag these small skiffs, or what we would consider lifeboats, they would drag them behind the main ship. Well, they recognized that the winds were so strong that they were afraid they were going to lose this smaller boat. And so Paul says that they brought it in with great difficulty. They got it up onto the deck of the ship. But then, notice what verse 17 says. This is something that we are not very familiar with in our day and time because it's not something that's necessary. When they had taken it on board, referring to the skiff or this lifeboat, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and so were driven. In those days, we understand all of these ships were made out of wood. This wood would flex, it would strain, it had the possibility of breaking under that strain. And so what they would commonly do, they would take either strong ropes or chains or cables of some type, and they would run those underneath the hull of the ship and pull it back up and kind of lash everything together to keep the ship from flexing as much. It's possible that you've been in an older building at some point. I know that there's some of like the older schoolhouses and things of that nature that we see in this county, that when you look up in the rafters, you'll see metal bars that have been run across and they're attached to the outside of those buildings. Well, the reason for that is to hold it together, keep it from separating and keeping that wood from coming apart. Well, that's what they were attempting to do with this ship. They were the mindset, and it was good. It worked in many instances, that they would put that bracing there, and it would keep those ships intact for longer, or at least would hold them together better than just the wood itself. But notice what their fear was. And this was something that I've looked into quite a bit, because I had never heard this terminology other than what's found here in this passage, the Syrtis Sands. We understand that people in that day and time, much more so than today, and especially Roman sailors, were very superstitious people. This was the day and time where they thought if you sailed too far, you'd fall off the edge of the earth. This was the time that they thought that, if we're caught in a storm, it's because we've made Poseidon, the god of the sea, angry with us. They were very superstitious. They gave meanings to everything that they saw. Certain omens, if they saw certain birds, it meant a certain thing. Certain cloud patterns meant certain things. Well, this Syrtis Sands was a location on the northern shore of Africa, which would be on the southern side of the Mediterranean Sea. And the Syrtis Sands was a place where over many, many years, large deposits of sand had built up along the shoreline. Well, there are some translations that refer to this as quicksand. We understand the concept of quicksand. It's sand that's at a certain has a certain amount of liquid that is in with that sand that makes it an unstable surface that causes anything of weight to sink down into that sand. Well, there are many places in the world, and again, using the example of Alaska, there are many places that we saw in Alaska along the shoreline where there were signs up saying, "Do not get on the sand." And the reason for that is because when the tides would go out and that sand would remain, there would be enough water left in that sand that if you tried to walk on it, you would sink up in it. Now, the majority of the times you would not sink, as we've seen on movies and things like that, all the way down to where it doesn't cover your head. But you would sink up to the point that you could not get out on your own. Well, this location known as the Syrtis Sands, these sailors were afraid of that location because this was an area where those sands were constantly shifting. Sometimes with the tides it would be farther out. Sometimes it would shift in some ways and it would be closer to the shore. And this was an area that they avoided because they knew that if they got their ship into this area of sand, they would get stuck. There would be no way for them to get free. And notice what they're saying. They were afraid that this storm was so severe that it was going to blow them from the island of Crete closer to the northern side of the Mediterranean all the way to the African coast. And so this was something that these men were worried about. They didn't want to get stuck in this location. And so they were trying to find some type of a way to keep the ship away from that area. But as I said, so much of the actions that they took was based upon the superstitious beliefs that they had. But continuing on, notice verse 18, "And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship." And so they have fought this storm all night long. The next day, they still can't control the ship. The ship's too heavy. It's at the mercy of the winds. And so now they start throwing cargo overboard, trying to lighten that ship, trying to get it higher up in the water. That way they can control it better. That way the anchors might be able to hold it more securely. And so they have got to the point, Paul warned them. He said, what's going to happen if we set out to sea? He said, you're going to lose the cargo, you're going to lose the ship, and you're going to lose lives. So now the first thing that Paul warned them of is taking place. They're losing cargo. Well, what did that mean for the owner of the ship? They were losing money. That shipment wasn't going to get where it needed to be, and so they were not going to receive payment for that. Well, then on the third day, notice how long this storm has been taking place, how long they have been fighting this. 3 days now. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Now, this was not a fishing vessel. I know most of the time today when we think about tackle, we think of it in fishing terms. But in those days, when they talked about the tackle of the ship, what this is saying is they were so desperate that they threw all of the ropes overboard, they threw their sails overboard, they threw their anchors overboard. Anything that was causing extra weight on that ship, they were trying to get rid of it. You see just how desperate this situation had become. Many of the things that they needed to control that ship, they've reached the point of desperation, saying, you know what, we've been trying for 3 days to control this ship. It's not doing us any good. Let's just get rid of those things. Let's lighten this ship so that hopefully we can get to shore. So they throw all of those things overboard. Verse 20, now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. So at this point, before we read anything else, it looks like Paul's prediction is taking place. They've already lost the cargo. They've reached the point where they've decided, you know what, this is a lost cause. We're not going to be able to save the ship. They've already thrown many of the parts of the ship overboard. And now they've all decided there's no hope. We're not going to survive this. I believe the reason why Luke does not give us an exact number of days that they were fighting this storm is because I believe eventually they lost track of the days. Notice it says that there was no, it says there were neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. This storm was there so intense, it was so dark that they couldn't tell if it was daytime or nighttime. They didn't know how many days had passed by. Because you notice up to this point, Luke has been very meticulous in telling us exactly how long things have been. But now he says, after we fought this a long time, and we couldn't tell that it was night or day, we finally gave up hope. 21, but after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me. I don't know that was really something that they wanted to hear at that point. It'd be kind of like it's one of us standing up and saying, I told you so. I told you not to do this. But Paul's reminding them, he says, men, you know, I warned you that this was what was going to take place. You should not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. So now he's trying to encourage these sailors, encourage these prisoners and these soldiers that are there. Yes, we're not going to be able to save the ship. It is going to be lost. But you can be encouraged in knowing nobody is going to lose their life. Well, how did he know this? Well, look at the next verse. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So he says, while all this storm was going on, and it seems to imply in this text that Paul was scared. He was afraid of what was going on. And this angel appears beside him to encourage him. Tells him, Paul, you're not going to lose your life. You have to make it to stand before Caesar. Essentially what this angel was saying is, Paul, your work is not complete. There's still more things that you have to accomplish in your life. And this angel says, he says, I'm going to make sure that your life is spared, but not just yours, but everyone that is on this ship. The ship's going to be destroyed, but everyone on this ship, their life is going to be spared. Therefore, Paul says, therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God, that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. So now, the angel has revealed what's going to take place. Paul says, men, I believe what God has sent his messenger to tell me. He said, but the only way that this is going to take place is we are going to have to intentionally run aground on a certain island, in a certain location. Well, running aground is what they have been trying to avoid all of these days during this storm. They didn't want to run aground because they knew the chance of losing their life was greater if they run aground and that ship began to break apart. They thought if they could remain out on the sea, if they could keep that ship together, that was their best chance of survival. But now Paul's telling them, he said, I already told you not to set sail, and you did it anyway. But now, an angel of the Lord has come to me and has told me, your lives will be spared, but you're going to have to listen to me this time. You're going to have to do exactly what I tell you to do. And you're going to have to run this ship aground on a certain island. Well, now, in verse 27, now when the 14th night had come, could you imagine being in that type of a storm, fighting that intensely for that long? We've had times here in Arkansas where it has rained every day for a long period of time. But I can't ever remember a time where we had what we would call strong thunderstorms that held on for that long. They may come and go. You may have one sporadically over several days. But something that holds on, that is that fierce for that long. 14 days. These men had to be exhausted. There was no way for them to get any kind of rest in this type of setting. They were fighting for their lives with every ounce of energy that they had. And notice, as the text tells us before, they hadn't had anything to eat. Why? Because they had thrown everything overboard. They were very weak. Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down the Adriatic Sea. The Adriatic Sea comes off of the north end of the Mediterranean Sea. And if I'm not mistaken, it flows or it runs between Italy and Greece. And so they're getting into a more confined area. They're trying to get as close to the location that they're trying to get to. Well, notice it says that they have been driven up and down the Adriatic Sea for all of these days. The winds just carrying them as it will. Remember, they have no anchor. They have nothing to control the direction of this ship. They're just letting it drive. Well, after 14 days being driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. They took some soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. The way they took soundings in those days, they would have a rope. And on that rope, ever so long on that rope, they would have a knot tied. And that knot would indicate a certain length. And then they would have some type of a heavy weight on the end of that rope, and they would toss it overboard. And whenever it reached the bottom of the sea, they would then be able to count those knots and see how deep the sea was. And so they were taking these soundings. They were recognizing the farther they went along, the sea was getting more and more shallow. They knew they were getting close to shore. Well then, fearing that they would run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. Now, one of the things that I find interesting when you go back and you look at the passage that says that they threw the tackle overboard, part of the tackle of the ship is the anchors. Well, after it says that they cast all of the tackle overboard, and it says that they just let the ship go as it may. But now it says that they still had 4 anchors on the ship. And so this is something that I do not really understand why things were worded exactly how it was. I don't know if these were somewhat like a reserve type of anchor, something of that nature, if it was something that was not considered part of the main tackle of the ship. But regardless, we find that when it came time to slow the ship down as it's traveling toward the shore of the sea, they still have these 4 anchors that are there on the ship, and they cast those out, trying to slow the forward motion of the ship. Well, then continuing, says they did this, they prayed for day to come. They did this so that they would have daylight, they could see what was ahead of them, how close they were to the shore. But then, and as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." So notice the warning here. If anybody leaves this ship, everybody's going to die. Well, these were sailors who were using their knowledge, using their expertise. They were trying to come up with some way to get some additional anchorage onto this ship so that it could slow it down further. So they're going to get in this smaller boat and set out from the ship, try to find something to anchor to hold it into place. Paul tells the centurion, you better stop those men. Because if they get off this ship, we're all going to die. You see, the warning from the angel was that they were all to stay on that ship. If they did that, then their lives would be spared. Well, notice what the soldiers do. In order to keep these sailors from getting off the ship, they cut the ropes off of the skiff and they throw it into the sea. So now no one has a way of escape. Yes, sir?
The soldiers had more faith in the sailors.
Yeah.
Everything, all their knowledge, all their means of saving themselves on the ship.
Well, and so much of that, Jared, I think it comes down to these sailors. They thought they were going off of what they've always been taught. These were men who were trained in what's the proper thing to do in this situation. Well, these soldiers, they had no clue. They were trained on how to wage war. And we know that the centurion already had a degree of trust in Paul. And so, yes, these soldiers, they're putting, as you said, more trust in what Paul has to say than in these sailors. And I can honestly say that after 14 days of being tossed around the sea with these sailors trying to do what they knew based upon their knowledge, I probably would be thinking, well, let's do what Paul says. What these men were trying to do based upon their ways and upon their knowledge, it wasn't working. So let's do what Paul says. Paul's the one that told us we shouldn't have set sail in the first place, and that's proven true. Well, let's see if what he says is true. Well, now they're all stuck on the ship. They don't have a lifeboat. They don't have any way of getting from that ship to the shore. And as day was about to dawn, verse 33, Paul implored them to take all food, saying, "Today is the 14th day. You have waited and continued without food and have eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you, take some nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread, gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged, and also took food themselves. And in all, we were 276 persons on the ship. It's a lot of people. 276 people on this ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. So the only foodstuff that they had kept with them was wheat, what they would need in order to prepare just the most basic of meal. Paul says, we've gone for 14 days. We've not eaten anything. Let's use what we have here. Let's eat. Let's make sure we have our strength. Well, they throw the rest of it overboard. When it was day, they did not recognize the land. Here were sailors who were used to sailing these seas. They were accustomed to the land masses that were there. Well, the sun comes up and these men have no clue where they're at. They don't recognize the land. But they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. Once again, and I think that a lot of it is simply due to the difference in language between Greek and English. You look at this, and in some places it looks almost like there's a contradiction. In some places it talks like they've thrown all of the anchors, all the sails, thrown everything overboard. But then as you read along, you see they still had the mainsail. They still had 4 anchors. And so really when it comes down to it, I think that it's simply a difference in language, not fully comprehending between the two languages exactly what all was considered in that terminology that they threw all of the tackle overboard. Because that term can refer to so many things. But notice it says that they reached a point where two seas met. Most people believe that this was where the Adriatic and the Mediterranean Sea come together. Well, oftentimes you will have intense weather conditions at locations where two seas come together. I know that, once again, when we were in Alaska, we went on a little day cruise, a sightseeing cruise, and we reached the point where the Gulf of Alaska opens into the Pacific Ocean. The Gulf of Alaska was just as calm as it could be. But as soon as you reached that point where it entered the Pacific Ocean, there were large waves. It was entirely different. And something about those two bodies of water coming together with the different currents and things of that nature, oftentimes it causes a lot of difficulty for sailors in those regions. And so here, notice it says that when they reached this point, they couldn't control the ship. They couldn't get it into this bay where they wanted it to go. They ran aground. And when they ran aground, the ship began to break apart. There was no more flexing of the ship. Part of it was stuck and it wasn't going to move. It couldn't flex, and so it began to break apart. Well, let's read through the end of the chapter. We are out of time, but I do want to get through the end of this chapter. We may make some more comments on it next Sunday. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. Well, what did Paul tell them? None of them were going to lose their life. The centurion, going back again to what Jared mentioned just a moment ago, he trusted in what Paul had to say. And so he would not let his fellow soldiers put these prisoners to death. The ones that could swim, they jumped overboard. They swam to land. They were safe. The ones that couldn't swim, they found parts of the ship. They held on to that, and the waves carried them to shore. And ultimately, all 276 people on that ship, their lives were saved. Something that the only possible explanation for that is God made that happen. In that type of scenario, they never should have survived for 14 days on the sea. The ship never should have held together that long. And then once they got to shore with this weather system still the way that it was, they never should have made it to shore. But they did. All of those lives were spared. And so that's where we're going to stop. And Lord willing, next Sunday morning, we'll pick up there in chapter 28 and verse 1.